Hello and welcome back after a short hiatus to All You Need Notes for Edexcel IGCSE History, and today on the second part of superpower relations from 1943 to 72 on the early developments in the Cold War from 1945 to 49, so just after the Second World War. And in this video I'll be giving two effects of everything in the specification to help you, especially with question B, but also for question C and for question A, to know the facts of what happened. And in the photo there you can see a picture from the Berlin airlift crisis, which is the last part in this section of the specification. So to begin with then, the Iron Curtain speech. The first effect of this was that it promoted the idea of the Soviet sphere of influence. So Churchill gave a speech, he'd been the former Prime Minister of Britain, in America in March of 1946. And in this he talked about the Declaration on Liberated Europe. If you remember from the first video, this had been agreed upon at the Yalta Conference, and it was where Stalin had agreed that all the Eastern European countries which the Soviets had occupied would have free and fair elections in Eastern Europe. However, he only paid lip service to this idea. He was not, in fact, promoting democracy. He was not promoting free elections in these countries. Churchill said that Stalin had broken this agreement. And he claimed that the satellite states, which the Soviets had invaded after the war, during the war, had control from Moscow, and they were under Stalin's influence. The Soviets and the communists were controlling these countries. They were not being given democratic elections. There was no opportunity for different political viewpoints to take power of these countries. They were firmly under the Soviets' grasp. And he gave an example with the Polish government. So before the war, there had been a Polish government, and they had been evacuated to London, and they were called the London Poles. After the war, when the Soviets came in, they set up their own communist government, which became known as the Lublin Poles. And what happened then was that these two governments came together post-war and governed Poland together. However, members of the London Poles had been disappearing mysteriously, and Churchill used this to say, well, obviously the Soviets are taking them, and this means that Stalin can't be trusted. He's not allowing democratic elections in these countries. He's not allowing the will of the people. He's removing any political opposition, and he is not obeying free and fair democratic elections. The second effect of the speech was that Churchill was showing a difference between the communist and the capitalist areas of Europe, so the communists in the east and the capitalists in the west. So both sides, the communists and capitalists, saw each other as opponents. Both sides saw that the other was trying to destroy their side and was trying to take over the world, essentially. And this divide, this rift between these two sides of Europe, led to stark differences across Europe. So martial aid was given to Western European countries by the US. We'll see this in 2 slides' time. And it meant that Western European countries recovered much quicker and were performing much, much better than Eastern European countries. And this led to a clear difference in the quality of life between the capitalist countries, which had recovered to pre-war levels by 1952, were doing really, really well, and the Eastern European countries, which were still feeling the consequences of the war, had not been rebuilt and were very, very poor. And so Churchill described this as the Iron Curtain, this border between the nice Western European countries, which had a good quality of life, and the really poor Eastern European countries. And it was really hard to cross this iron border. And so this was this Iron Curtain, which was the border. There was a huge difference between the two sides, and it did lead to people trying to move across from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. The next thing then is the Truman Doctrine. The first effect of this was that America committed itself to help fight communism. So President Truman, on the 12th of March 1947, gave a speech to Congress in which he announced a huge economic package of $400 million which he would give to Greece. The Greek government at the time was trying to fight communist rebels who were trying to take over the government, but this money allowed the Greek government to keep fighting the communist rebels and to keep democracy in Greece. And Truman then pledged to help any country with money, with military assistance, with whatever they needed to help fight the communist rebels if they were under threat. And this led later to America getting involved in Korea in the Korean War, Vietnam in the Vietnam War, and Cuba as well. Essentially, Truman was very, very scared about the communists trying to take over, and so wanted to stop this. And this leads on to the second effect, which was that America implemented a policy of containment. So Truman had received the long telegram, so-called because it was very, very long, and in this, essentially, it said that the Soviets were trying to spread communism all over the world, and especially in Europe. And Truman was very, very scared about communists spreading. It was the direct opposite of capitalism. It opposed everything he believed in, and he did not want this to happen. So he thought the best policy would be to stop it spreading, i.e. to contain it. He couldn't do anything about the countries that were already communist. The Soviets had their boots on the ground in the satellite states. America could not just go in and invade them all and stop it. The Soviets were too strong and powerful for this. So he couldn't do anything about the countries that were already communist, but he could stop communism spreading. And this led, as we'll see on the next slide, to the Marshall Plan, where America gave $13 billion to Europe to help them rebuild. And because they could rebuild, this would mean that communism was less likely to spread to those countries, because if people were happy, if people had jobs and healthcare and houses and were fed and healthy, this would mean that they were less likely to say, oh, how about we try communism, because they're not in such a poor, desperate state. So the Marshall Plan then. The first effect of this was that Europe was rebuilt. So America gave $13 billion to countries in Europe in June of 1947, including France, Germany, Britain. There were 17 in total. And these countries used this money to buy food, to raise employment levels, to build houses, to increase the availability of healthcare, so that these countries were then less susceptible to communism. People were happy, so they would not want to try to change the political landscape dramatically. In order to accept this money, countries had to agree free trade agreements with America. And this just confirms Stalin's own fears that America was trying to spread capitalism everywhere. America was trying to make sure that all the countries could trade with America without taxes, and Stalin really did not like this. However, the money did work, and the economies of the countries that accepted the money were boosted to pre-war levels by 1952. So very, very quickly these countries really recovered from the war. The second effect was that it created a rift in Europe. So Stalin really disliked this. He accused America of what he called dollar imperialism, so trying to make Europe economically dependent on America with all these free trade agreements. And so he banned the satellite states from taking the money. And this led to a rift along the Iron Curtain. So the Western side, the capitalist side, rebuilt much, much faster. They had a better quality of life. They had more money, more food, more healthcare, etc. Eastern European countries, very, very poor, and weren't doing as well. Stalin tried to stimulate the economies of Eastern Europe, but failed. So he set up Comecon in 1949, but this didn't work out. And we'll see Comecon in 2 slides' time. So on to Cominform then. So there are 2 different organisations which you need to know about, Cominform and Comecon. The com part in both of them stands for communist, inform stands for information, so think propaganda, and econ stands for economics, so think money. So Cominform then, first effect was that it strengthened Stalin's control over Eastern Europe. So this was set up in September of 1947, and it represented all European communist parties, including those from the satellite states, which were the leading governmental powers, but also the ones from countries like France and Italy. These communist parties weren't in government, but they were still strong, and they were still under Stalin's influence. And this made sure that Stalin could ensure loyalty in Eastern European governments, so that these communist parties were toeing the line, were following the Soviet Union to make sure that the satellite states stayed loyal to the Soviets. And through Cominform, these parties could share propaganda. They could share it across Europe to all the different European communist parties. They could show it. They could try to increase the attraction of communism. And this just made sure that Stalin could spread his own views of communism to all these countries, making sure that they followed the Stalinist communist approach. And so it increased Stalin's influence over the communist parties of Europe, but especially of Eastern Europe. The second effect was that these countries in Comecon tried to raise anger against the Marshall Plan. So, as we saw, Stalin accused Marshall aid of dollar imperialism. Europe was reliant on America, and so he made sure that the countries where communism was the ruling party rejected Marshall aid, so that none of Eastern European countries were allowed to accept Marshall aid. It was offered to them, but they had to refuse it, and so they recovered much, much slower from the war. In terms of the Western European countries, because their communist parties were represented in Cominform, they had to organise strikes against Marshall aid. Basically, Stalin feared that because the countries that accepted this aid would have better economics, would have better healthcare, better jobs, better housing, etc., it would weaken the attraction of communism. So these countries would be less likely to accept a communist uprising. And this meant that he had to try and stop this. And so the communist parties in France, in Italy, for example, organised strikes from workers. So in France, 2 million workers went on strike against Marshall aid. It didn't make much of a difference, so France still accepted it. The second thing that was set up was Comecon. So the first effect of this was that Eastern Europe developed slower than Western Europe. So Comecon was set up in January 1949, and as I've alluded to, it was set up to oppose Marshall aid and to try and improve the satellite states. Marshall aid being given to the Western European countries to try and successfully improve them. Eastern European countries had Comecon, which didn't. In order to help improve jobs, food, health, etc., you needed a lot of money, and the Americans had $13 billion to give. The Soviets were cash-strapped after the Second World War. They had very little to give, and so there was very little improvement. And so Comecon failed. Stalin hated this idea of dollar imperialism. He didn't want America to have an economic reliance, for European countries to have an economic reliance on America. But because he wasn't ploughing money into the satellite states countries, they had to. There was a huge split in quality of life across the Iron Curtain. They recovered a lot slower, and so there was this huge rift in the quality of life across the Iron Curtain. The second effect was that Stalin affirmed his sphere of influence. So through Comecon, he discouraged any trade whatsoever by satellite state countries with America. He wanted the Soviet Union, he wanted the satellite states to be independent, to be completely self-reliant, to be able to have everything they needed for themselves without having to trade. But what happened through Comecon was that each of the satellite states put money into a group sort of funding allocation, but the Soviet Union used that money not to give it to these countries to develop healthcare or whatever. They used it for themselves to help develop the Soviet Union. And so the US didn't gain economic power in Eastern Europe, that's true. Stalin maintained his influence, yes. So he made sure that satellite states weren't trying to get close to America, but obviously it meant the satellite states weren't very good. They didn't recover at all. And Soviet Union was very, very selfish, and it used any money whatsoever for itself. So the satellite states really did struggle. The final thing in the specification is the Berlin Crisis of 1948 to 49, also known as the Berlin Airlift Crisis, not to be confused with the Berlin Wall, which happens a few decades later, and you do need to know about, so don't confuse them. This is a huge part of the specification. So not only do you need to know the effects of it, which we'll look at in the next slide, but you need to know what caused it and what happened, because, for example, question C might ask you what the biggest cause of the Berlin airlift crisis was, for example. So you do need to be aware of what happened in this one. So let's go through it. In 1947, if you remember, after the war, Germany was split up into 4 different zones of occupation: for America, for Britain, for France, and for the Soviets. And the American and the British zones of occupation decided to join together to become what they called Bizonia, and to be a strong bulwark against communism. Because if those 2 zones recovered well economically, then communism was less likely to spread through to Western Europe. But Stalin thought that America and Britain were just trying to make their old enemies strong again. They'd been fighting against Germany just over 2 years ago together, and Stalin was very, very scared that they were trying to make the old enemies stronger again in order to defeat, or at least to try to defeat, the Soviet Union. So he was very, very suspicious about what the US and the UK were doing. Bizonia accepted a new currency. They adopted a new currency, and this made them become more successful than the Soviet zone of occupation, and Stalin was very, very jealous about this. Bizonia was getting stronger, and he was very fearful about the intentions of this. And so in June 1948, he shut off land routes to Berlin. If you remember, not only was Germany divided into 4 zones of occupation, but Berlin, which was in the Soviet zone, was also divided into 4 zones for each of the 4 countries. And so what Stalin did was he stopped access by road to Berlin, so that the American and the British zones in Berlin weren't able to get supplies from their main zones in Germany. So the citizens in Berlin would starve. And this was a direct challenge to President Truman. Stalin was trying to get him to completely give up control of Berlin, and this will be a huge propaganda victory for Stalin to say that the US and UK were fleeing from Berlin and that he was now in complete control of the German capital, and so he tried to shut off land routes. However, this did not work. Instead of just giving up Berlin, Britain and America decided to fly in supplies. Stalin could cut off land routes, but it would be very hard for him to cut off air routes. And so they sent aeroplane after aeroplane carrying 1,000 tons of supplies in total. So of food, of fuel, whatever the citizens needed not to starve and to remain alive. And this happened for nearly an entire year until Stalin couldn't do anything about it, and so he ended the blockade in May 1949. This was a huge propaganda defeat for him, and America and Britain seemed stronger. And in the picture there you can see loads and loads of aeroplanes coming in to unload all the supplies for the citizens of Berlin. So what are the effects of the Berlin crisis then? Well, there are 2 main ones you need to know, which are specified in the specification. First of all, East and West Germany were created. So after Bizonia, because Britain and America saw that Stalin could no longer do anything about it, they joined with the French zone of occupation to become the Federal Republic of Germany in May of 1949, which later became known as West Germany. Stalin, in retaliation, made the Soviet zone the German Democratic Republic in October of 1949, which later became known as East Germany, and was a very ironic title because there was absolutely no democracy there. And this meant that Germany was split down the middle. There was a divide between capitalism and communism, and crucially it showed that the allies who had been fighting Germany those years before were now no longer collaborating and in complete opposition. Germany was split into 2 different countries. There was a rift again in quality of life. The Federal Republic, West Germany, recovered a lot better from the war, and now these 2 sides were in complete opposition to each other. The second effect was that NATO was created. So America and Britain had seen this huge threat to Berlin by the communists, and they were very, very worried about what Stalin might do. So they decided to make an alliance known as NATO, which is still going today. So this was set up in April of 1949, and they decided that if one member of NATO was attacked by any country, then every other member of NATO would come to try and assist them in whatever way they could. So this meant that if Stalin tried to attack one of the members of NATO, all the other countries would come to try and stop him. And this gave America much greater involvement and responsibility in protecting Europe and West Germany, in protecting Europe and West Germany when it joined from any sort of communist attack. West Germany joined a lot later. It joined in 1955, and this led in retaliation to the Soviets creating the Warsaw Pact. We'll see this in the next video, but the Soviets created the Warsaw Pact because West Germany joined. They saw the US and the UK trying to revive their old enemy. They were very scared of this, and so they created the Warsaw Pact as a similar thing for the satellite states. So if one attacked, the others would attack the attacker. Just do remember, if you're quoting that Stalin had died by 1955, so Stalin didn't create the Warsaw Pact, the Soviets did. Just a key piece of information there. But that's the end of this video of all you need notes for Edexcel IGCSE history on the early developments in the Cold War, from the end of the Second World War, in the superpower relations topic for paper 1. If you did enjoy and found this helpful for your GCSEs or your mocks or whatever, please do like and subscribe. And thank you